Hi, Lauren. Hi, Louise.
Hi.
And hi, everyone else who's joined this breakout. Please say hello in the chat if you can, and perhaps where you're from, what country you're on, if you know. It's really exciting to be part of this last session of the SheEO Summit. I hope it's been really amazing and inspiring for all of you. I know I personally feel incredibly energized whenever I hear or chat to any women of that network. And that session we just had, I think, was really very impactful. And the future is, well, not just the future, I think the time now is in very, very safe hands after hearing that story. So in this session, we're talking about community, and that can mean lots of different things to different people. In this session, we're going to be looking at what it would create to create a bit of a blueprint for community, what community means, what the pillars it needs to be involved. So we'll be using the chat function quite a lot. So I hope you've got that open in front of you. But just to start us off, I want to throw to Louise first. Louise and Lauren here and myself from Neighbourlytics probably come at community from different angles. And I think one of the great things about a topic like community is it is so multifaceted and multi-layered in how we understand it. So I'm just wondering, Louise, could you just tell us a little bit about Climate Positive Australia, what you do, what's kind of brought you to the SheEO network by way of just kicking us off?
Yeah, absolutely, Lucinda. Hello, everybody. I'm coming to you from Wajak Noongar country, which is over on the west coast. I'm actually in Perth at the moment, but I kind of hail from around the sort of Bunbury kind of region down on the southwest coast. So it's a really beautiful part of the world. And I work for an organisation that essentially helps you to understand what your carbon footprint is, helps you to think about ways you might want to reduce that carbon footprint. And then what we do is we plant trees. So we have projects across Australia where we're working with landholders to plant, to sequester carbon. But more than that, we're actually looking to ensure that the planting that you do helps the wider community. And when I talk about community, I'm talking about a really wide community, which is the other trees, the soil, the animals, the birds, and the insects, and the fungi, and that huge wider community of which we're all a part.
Thanks, Louise. And I think sometimes we don't think as holistically as that when we're thinking about neighbourhoods and place around all of the intersecting systems that come with that. Lauren, I'd love to hear more about your food collective and what's brought you here today, and I guess what inspires you about community.
Yeah, thank you. I'm talking on a what we call land today. And I guess beautiful to be part of today's sessions and amazing people and inspiring us to do better things for the future. And I guess beautiful to follow on from what Louise is talking about, because our passion is food, and at your food collective, we really are revolutionising food for future generations. And food has the ability to have one of the most powerful social and environmental impacts. And from that really big picture that Louise was talking about, from saving the planet with what you eat, down to just the social impacts of food and connecting around good food and supporting local and food security. It's at the heart really of everything that we do. So I guess at your food collective, we're redefining the food system and re-engineering it from the soil up, because that's where it all starts. And I guess, so we connect consumers directly to the fields of local growers. We're redefining local, we're working with regenerative growers. So really creating a food system that can sustain us into the future. When you look at our current food system, it is completely broken. And I think when you talk about communities and how we connect and grow, I think food is at the heart of that, because if we're not nourishing ourselves properly, then we don't have the capacity, I think, to build stronger communities or the freedom of thought to do that. So I think, food is really the essence of that, and we're trying hard to create sustainable food systems that can feed us.
Thanks so much, Lauren. And just by way of introduction, I'm Lucinda from Neighbourlytics. We're one of the SheEO ventures in 2018, but also very quickly after that became activators, because we both received so much from the network and are so grateful to be part of this, Neighbourlytics looks at measuring the livability and well-being of neighbourhoods based on their big data footprint. So we're really interested in how do we actually measure what matters when it comes to places and neighbourhoods, which are traditionally measured in terms of traffic flows or population, but rather than the actual heartbeat of a neighbourhood. It's economic ecosystem, it's social connection, it's social life. So on that note, thanks for sharing these passionate stories. Really, I think of the importance of food and place and systems in our lives. I just want to just sticking with you, Lauren, for a moment. What does community mean to you personally?
I guess, I think you touched on it earlier, Cinda, about community and the focus that COVID has brought to that. It's been fantastic, and I think it's really amplified what community means for all of us. But for me personally, community probably means a place where we find support, love and nourishment to dream and to follow our dreams. I think that's probably a pretty broad statement, but I think that's really what a good community does. It encourages you and supports you to be yourself. And I think the pillars that create that we can talk about in a little while. But really, your community should be something that supports you and propels you forward and encourages you to create, I guess, a future that we can all believe in.
And while I'm asking Louise the same question, I'm wondering if everyone listening wants to think about what community means to them and start writing that up in the chat too, because I think there's likely some common themes that we're discussing around how do we personally experience community, what does it mean to us? So if I throw that question to you, Louise, what does community mean to you?
So I actually really love the title of this breakout, Rooted to Community, and your roots to community, because it's kind of, for me, it's how you're connecting with everybody else. And it might be in a proximity of a place, but it also could be that you're connecting in other ways. As a woman from the UK originally, a lot of my community still takes place online. So for me, community doesn't necessarily have to have a place specifically, but what it does have to do is make me feel like I'm rooted into something that I personally believe in, and that I feel that I've got shared values with the individuals who I'm in community with. And I think that, talks to trying to be as inclusive as possible of everyone's needs in that community, not just, the people who think they're sort of a priority. So, and I think the trees really teach us a lot about that, actually, because of the way that they interact in their community. There's stories where there is a mother tree in the whole of the forest. And so that mother tree, when she, her life is coming to an end, takes her nutrients back in to feed into the soil and nourish the rest of that community. So, yeah, I think we can learn a lot from trees about community. That's my personal view.
Cinda, there's a couple of comments in the chat about, being connected to the environment is what's important to them for community. Do you have any data to support that, communities that are rich in, in their environmental attributes do build stronger communities socially?
Yeah, the thing that we've been particularly looking at through COVID is how behaviour and lifestyle has changed as a result of that. And, the dominant trend there is that people are becoming more local. And that's something I think we've all experienced, but practically what that means is that there's an increase in the digital footprint in neighbourhoods, which might have previously been in CBDs, so we can kind of quantify where some of that change is. But one of the big lifestyle shifts has been really an affinity with nature. And I think what the difference is that in pre-COVID data, there is a strong level of interaction with public space always, but public space can mean ovals, streets, plazas, like all different parts of these components which make up our public realm, not necessarily green space or treed spaces. And the shift that's happened during COVID is seeing up to, I think in Melbourne, a 238% increase in sort of participation and engagement with nature. And I think that just shows from kind of a resilience perspective is when the going gets tough, the places that we really want to be natural and having those places in our urban environments is like those urban forests or access to nature is perhaps something that's really shown up during COVID that there are some places where that's really easy to do, that you might already have a creek or a park in your neighbourhood, but other areas where that doesn't exist or it's not in walking distance. And that really just shows, I guess, the task that we have ahead of us around really creating sustainable places and reintegrating nature in our environments. So yeah, that's been interesting to watch. And certainly from my perspective, a lot of the things that you guys have mentioned around belonging and having that community around us to sort of support and amplify change really resonate as well. Just moving around sort of the sort of different personal experiences of what community means to us, and I want to keep this going in the chat too. There's some comments around people living together and practicing common ownership. Thanks, Maria. And that we've never been more appreciative of parks and green spaces, from Rebecca. I think particularly any Melburnians in the room, but that's sort of something that's everywhere. Moving towards, like, if we were to think about, like, we've kind of got an opportunity here. I think kind of, we're not out of the pandemic by a long shot, but we do have kind of a mindset of reframing a new way forward. And if we're thinking about what community should look like, what are the pillars or the principles or the things that we should be considering? And that's a question to all of us here. So if you've got ideas around, what are the pillars of a strong community that we need to be considering? What should we be including when we think about shaping, being part of, or taking action for community? If you want to throw that into the chat, but also to Louise or Lauren, like the principles that you see in the work that you do, or the things that we should be sharing, what does that look like for you?
Yeah. I'll kick it off. So I guess that for me, and particularly, and for like the work that we do, obviously it's going to start with food and our fundamental connection to that. And I think if you look at building stronger communities, it does start with their nourishment, understanding where their food comes from, and connecting with the community that grows that food. I think that it adds so much more value to what you're eating. It does, it nourishes you better because the food has traveled, like scientifically, there is more nutrients in food that's traveled a shorter distance. If you can dish up a plate and you can name the producers that grew that for you, you feel so much better. You put so much more value on that food, and it feels better sharing it. And I think it brings us all back to slowing down and connecting around food is so important in a really traditional way. Like, it doesn't have to be a complicated way, but just getting together over food that you really enjoy, chatting and sharing, and I think building those connections between each other and our place is incredibly important. I think also the connection through food really strengthens the connection between our urban and rural communities, and I think that's also incredibly important to build sustainability going forward, and we've really lost that. I think people are so, like in both urban and rural communities are completely removed from each other in a number of ways, and we don't realise how reliant we are on each other. And for us, I guess it's been really beautiful during COVID, watch that come alive a little bit, and as people have turned to support local more. But for me and for the work that we do, and I think for stronger communities, I think food is at the heart of that, and just in a simple way, but local food grown by people
I so agree with that, Lauren, and I can see in the chat as well, everyone's sort of saying about this idea of shared experience. And, we experience that in terms of, the agricultural community who are being asked, to plant trees on their land, but also that, they've got to think about food production side of that. So, trying to have that balance and making sure that everyone's views have been included, and that, that sort of shared experience between people who are wanting to, do what they believe is the right thing to do ecologically, to plant trees and to sequester more carbon, is then balanced with the agricultural community and their need for financial stability, economic stability, and long-term sustainability as well. It's hugely, hugely important. So I think, for me, the most that we can foster that idea of shared experience, where we can communicate and where we can understand the viewpoints of a wider subset, which I suppose comes down to inclusion, is for me feels like a really strong pillar.
I love inclusion both with people, but inclusion of nature and food, and that sort of element of local. I think for me, location has a lot to do with it too. And I guess my personal experience is I grew up living in a lot of different countries, and it was really sort of common experience for me to see that the place that you lived had a really big impact on your culture and life and outlook on opportunity. And so where we live has a lot to do with it as well. And I'm often interested in, like, what are the opportunities that neighborhood creates that help foster community? Like, do you have good public spaces? Do you have access to jobs and schools and community facilities that are in walking distance, that are kind of like part of your everyday life, not something that you have to go out to get and then come back to? There's not that separation of home and the rest of your life, but it's kind of all part of that collective system. We're going to come back to the pillars question, because it's kind of a deep one, but it's also something that we want to work on just in the next little segment that we've got here, together, on what we can work on as SheEO, what it would look like if we had a blueprint for the SheEO community or for our local communities, in lots of ways. But the last part of this is, we are talking about systems change in this particular session, or thinking about what community looks like as a system and the changes. Like, what are the systems that we need to be thinking about changing? So, Lauren, you mentioned before that our food system's really broken. I'm wondering if that's something that you can share a little bit more about, and how that impacts community.
Yeah, definitely. I guess so. Yeah, in our race to commoditize food, we've forgotten about how it's grown, where it comes from, about how much we pay for that, and the nutrients in the food that we grow. And there are some staggering statistics out there. So, like, in Australia alone, we throw away nearly 2/3 of the food that we actually produce, which is horrific.
Wow.
At an alarming rate, we're losing a lot of our small to medium-sized family farms, and so our food system doesn't have any resilience in it. And in the face of a changing climate, that's incredibly important. More than 65% of adult Australians are obese or overweight, and less than 6% of them actually eat the recommended daily intakes of fruit and vegetable. And again, I think that we can largely argue that's because there's no inspiration on supermarket shelves when it comes to the fresh produce section. And then, alarmingly, of those 6% that actually do eat the recommended daily intake of fruits and vegetables, they're only eating 1% of the variety that we did less than 50 years ago. Again, so it's a food system that doesn't have the ability to feed us into the future, is completely open to disruption, like the drought and fires. And then on top of that, there's research that shows that we've only got 60 years of topsoil left to continue farming in our current methods. So there are alarming environmental and social statistics that show that we need to drive drastic change in our food system. And so I think the answers to that are actually really simple, and it's just decentralizing the food system and adding value to it where it needs to be. So paying producers fairly for what they do. So coming back to Louise, what you were talking about with the disconnect between sometimes conservation and environmental outcomes and agriculture, but trying to find a connection there, working with regenerative growers and helping consumers understand how their food reaches their plate, who they should be paying for that, and how they can really drive change, I think will make a huge difference. And it really is, I think, we're trying to understand, blueprints for community or how we approach climate change, all of those sorts of issues. You can sometimes be really overwhelmed, but I think definitely from the angle that we're approaching it from, it's actually really simple, and as simple as what you put on your plate every night of the week. And I think searching out those solutions and really supporting local food systems. And I think, we have seen a push towards that during COVID, and people are really thinking about where their food comes from and how they can build local food security. And it was probably out of being a little bit scared. And I think off the back of the droughts and bushfires, and often we're pushed to a tipping point before actually driven into action. And I think that's what COVID was for a lot of people when it comes to their food.
Can I go to one stat that you just threw out before, that we 1% of the variety of 50 years ago. Was that? Can you talk to me a little bit about more? That seems sort of quite alarming, because in some ways we probably have access to a global food network now that wasn't there 50 years ago. In some ways it should be more diverse. So what is it about the diversity? Is it it's just not available in the supermarkets, or?
So I guess largely there's a couple of things at play. Largely is the commoditization of food and centralization of the food system have meant that we've moved to large-scale monocultures of crops. And so currently, if you look globally, I'm pretty sure it's less than 12 plant species and about 5 animal species that feed more than 90% of the population across the world. So, you know, we're completely open to vulnerabilities and change. But then a large driver of it is the fact that food is shipped halfway across the world these days to reach it, like from where it's grown to reach the consumer. So what we've done is we've narrowed our selection of varieties down to those varieties that can travel longer distances. So things that can be picked well before they're ripe, ripened artificially. Whereas historically, food was ripened on the bush. We had a number of different varieties that would see us through different seasons, but it wasn't really very good for transporting. Like strawberries, that when they're ripe are really soft and squishy. You can't fly them halfway across the world and still be happy to eat them when they arrive on your doorstep. So that's been a large driver, is the globalization of the food system. So again, if you can bring that back to local, and a lot of the different growers we work with, they're really beautiful. Like a really good example is our table grape grower. So he has 36 different varieties of table grapes that he grows through the season. And so obviously, you've got your early season varieties, and then it sees you all the way through from like December until March. And we slowly move through all of those different varieties, and every single one of them has a different flavor, a different skin type, all of these beautiful qualities. Whereas when you're in the supermarket, for most of the grape season, there's just 2 different types that you see because they're easy to grow. They're, they probably have a higher yield. They can be ripened artificially and transported long distances. So, it's pretty interesting.
And Lauren, how does that sort of intersect with your work, and what are some of the systems that you're really thinking about?
So I guess it's just making it really easy to connect consumers to local growers, because I think you often hear, as I said before, like, you hear, go and support your local grower. It's better for the environment, better for the flavor, better for yourself. But how do we do that? So I guess building networks of those local producers, and obviously we use in our community an e-commerce platform to connect consumers through to that. So busy families can go, okay, great. I can find my growers. They're all right here. It's one box. It'll get delivered to me. In a short supply chain and decentralized food system. So it's about, I guess, our role as a business, or what we're trying to do is make it really easy for people to enact systems change in the food system, because it's hard. It's harder to do it the way that we do it, but it's the right way to do it. So we're wearing that so that consumers have the choice, I guess, in terms of what they're creating.
And Louise, like what's your take on the systems that we really need to be pushing to think about changing? I'm sure you've got lots to say on that topic.
Yeah, I kind of have. And I also just want to say that change is really hard. So, it can be really hard, particularly changing some of the sort of habits, the ingrained kind of habits that we get into. Talking about food, sometimes it's easier, isn't it, just to go to your local supermarket and pick what's off the shelf because you're busy. So I think whatever systems that we put, changes that we put in place for everyone need to be, we need to support each other in the changes that we want to make. I think for me, that's, in the organisation that I lead, that's a really important thing. We try and help people to measure their carbon footprint so that they can understand, what are their personal emissions? How does that work? But we try and come to that without a huge amount of judgment with it, because, we are all on this sort of journey where we've got to kind of look at how we reduce. And yes, things are getting more and more difficult because obviously the urgency around that increases with each day. But I think, if everyone's making smaller changes in their lifestyles and what they're doing, that's obviously going to have a huger impact overall. I think the other thing in terms of system changes, if we decide that we're going to reduce or offset, that we do that in a way that has far more benefits than just the carbon sequestration. You know, it's really kind of easy to go out and just plant monocultures of trees. That's a simple thing to do and actually can sequester quite a lot of carbon. But if it's encroaching on our food security, if it means that creatures no longer have homes, that the soil's not benefiting, that water quality is not improving, then actually we could be creating bigger problems than we think we're trying to solve. So for me, I suppose at the level of system change, it's about can we put country and nature first? And that's actually quite a difficult thing to sort of wrap your heads around, because that actually means putting that before yourself and your own needs, before your family's needs. It's about putting the land first, because ultimately without the land, we've got nothing. We have no food, we have no air, you know, we have no water. So for me, that's the real systems change, is that, you know, if we think from a natural law perspective, how do we always put country first? And I think if we do that and then we embed that into our systems, then ultimately we will always do the right thing.
Louise, I'm a conservation biologist training and sort of come at my career from a different direction, and I think it's from exactly what you've said that's driven me to look at our food system, because there is complete frustration. I don't think even our legislation puts the environment first when it comes to what it's doing, and it's really hard. It's really hard to try and drive that change, I think, particularly when you don't have governments supporting it, be it something that we all need to be part of.
Yeah, and those that are working on sort of the legal changes around that, so rights of nature, go out and support the people. I would say, you know, if you want systems change, go out and support those people and organisations that are working to change the legislation behind rights of nature. That's a huge, huge piece of this jigsaw puzzle of systems change.
There's been some comments in the chat here around all kinds of systems that intersect, I think, with food and land, from Marion on thinking about how it affects our gut health and our immunity. There was some comments further back about bees.
Yeah.
I think let's not forget about the bees. A critical part of the system and the chain there, and some also from Marion, some good recommendations of other rural communities who are doing different collectives and things. So I hope you're following that. We're going to have sort of a bit more of an open discussion now around creating a community blueprint, and I'm going to throw to Lauren and Louise to take us through some questions there.
Yeah, I guess it would be great to throw it out to you guys in the community there and the chat, to just identify what are the pillars that you believe are important to building strong communities. And I know that we've been talking about some stuff there, but it would be great if you could walking. I love it. I think that's really good to touch on, particularly COVID. And I think for you guys in Melbourne, I think you do like getting out and enjoying your local space. I think it really makes you understand where you chose to live. And we've got an amazing cycleway near us. And during COVID, it was completely full, which is so beautiful to see. And people were out, I know we weren't supposed to be chatting, but at distance, you know, you're out passing each other and really active in the community, which is rather than all being behind closed doors, I think is really positive.
Yeah, I think as well, you know, for me, it's great that you put walking, Lucinda, because I just think walking is such an amazing way to connect to your local community. I've recently moved house, and I take my little dog out for a walk every day, and I actually know my community because I meet other dog walkers, I meet people who are doing their gardens and things like that. So because they're really simple things, kind of, that can actually build community.
Yeah, I think if we think about like, walking achieves so many benefits. Like, but one of the challenges is a lot of our neighbourhoods are not particularly walkable. Bit to define. So yeah, I like your comment, Jodie, around making eye contact, or eye contact, like smiling with your eyes. That's what we do in Melbourne. That's what we do in Victoria. Smile with our eyes now. I'm allowed to take it off because I'm inside a meeting room.
And Marilyn said, concerned about older people living in their own homes, isolated, especially under COVID restrictions. It's incredibly hard, isn't it?
I'm interested to know whether people feel that it's important to know your neighbours, because I think this is actually, I mean, generally that sort of, I think, yes, that's a good idea, but it also can be quite hard, I think, in a lot of places to meet neighbours. And community can be lots of things, like you mentioned, Louise, at the beginning, that there are lots of digital tribes and community, including the one that we're part of today. I'm interested to know whether people think it's important to still actually know people really locally, or whether it's sort of sufficient to participate in sort of more local neighbourhoods, or whether, digital is important in that way. So
I feel like we were so lucky during COVID. We live in such a beautiful neighbourhood that, the kids were still connecting because we're sort of sharing the same core genes, so it was okay. But it's so amazing that, I think a walk that should take you, 5 minutes, not even, to do 500 metres down the road, it never takes that long. It takes much longer because you're always stopping and chatting and saying hello. Even the other day, my son went to get mulberry leaves for the silkworms that were effectively growing and haven't killed
silkworms.
I know, the gift that keeps on giving. And he was, he took 25 minutes. He's like, I had to stop and chat to Bruce, and then Alan was outside cleaning his car, so I had a chat. And I think it builds security and at all levels of a household, I think, because everyone probably interacts with different neighbours. So I think that really strengthens, again, the community ties, and it means that I think you start to do things a little bit more traditionally, like asking for food from your neighbour's cupboard, and not always rushing down to the supermarket to get that sort of stuff. And I think that's incredibly rewarding socially.
I can see Carrie saying, and I totally agree, condos and apartments, it's much more difficult to connect. I think people like trying, in a way, I know when I've lived in apartments, it's almost like that privacy thing, isn't there, that when you've got your own space in a house, it's a kind of different. So I totally agree with Carrie. It can be much more difficult, actually, in a sort of condo and apartment space to do that connection.
Yeah, and then Marianne's written here as well that one of the strongest connecting experiences I had was Anzac Day this year. I don't know many people in our street, but we definitely all connected as a community for a shared experience. We had a very similar moment on our street. It was quite sobering and lovely to see everyone out there in silence at distance, showing respect and connecting in that sort of way as well. I guess the other question that we've sort of marked down for this discussion is trying to understand what actions we can take in our own life to enact changes and build stronger communities. And I think that's really important because it's an incredibly important part of building this blueprint and understanding. Take home something that you can change or do today rather than feeling overwhelmed or thinking that our communities aren't where they need to be. So it'd be great. I don't know if Lucinda or Louise, you'd like to start.
So you probably know what I'm going to say. So go out and connect with your local tree. It sounds a bit woo-woo, but in reality, there's something really incredibly energizing about finding a tree in your neighborhood that you have deep respect for, and you can feel they have deep respect for you too. It's just that way of being able to connect with, the wider landscape. So go in the traditional way, go hug a tree. I think, you'll get a huge amount from it.
I know the city of Melbourne, and I think they still do, but they had email. You could email the trees. They gave them tags. It's actually one of the most beautiful initiatives, but people would write like love letters to these trees. Like, it was really quite extraordinary, and I quite like that idea of being able to have a personal connection with a tree like that. I mean, personal actions for me, like I have an embarrassing thing to admit, if I can. I think we're in a safe space here, but before Neighbourlytics, I ran a kind of an organisation that was really about community organising and placemaking, and then I tried to run a Christmas street party pre-COVID in my street, and like one person came, and so my whole family's like, oh, like, you do this for a job, but you can't even meet your own neighbours. So there's lots of things that I learned from that experience. But one thing that I'm going to do is, I have actually this year been spending a lot of time out the front in the balcony because I wanted to at least make eye contact with people in the street if I wasn't allowed to see anyone in Melbourne Stage 4. And actually, because of that, I noticed that there's actually a lot of other people doing the same thing, and I have met more neighbours this year than before. So one immediate action that I want to take is actually to try again to have street drinks. They will need to be outside and socially distanced in our neighbourhood, because I actually think there's a lot of different people than there were a few years ago, but also I think there is a real collective mindset that wasn't there 12 months ago around really needing to rely on people locally, especially when you haven't been able to go very far or go out. So that's something that I'm going to personally do in the next week, is organise that.
Looks like there's some great advice there from Jenny as well, saying that their street has regular meals out together and New Year's Eve celebrations in the park at the end of the street, which is beautiful. We also do have a really fantastic street Christmas party, and it's great. And I think what COVID has done, I guess, is, as you said, refocus people to local. So you aren't zipping around, you've got a lot more time at home. And I know myself, the times where I've probably connected the most to my community are when you've been home with young kids, or when you are actually at home at the house for extended periods. It's probably not necessarily appropriate in terms of COVID at the moment, but one way that I feel is really good to connect with your community is if you're cooking something, just do twice the batch and drop it off to a neighbour or share it with someone. And then it often starts a cascade of people sharing food and recipes and connecting over that, which is really good. And it also helps people, if they're busy one night and rushing to get stuff out, it's, I guess, a radical, offer of radical generosity as well by helping food. One thing that I think that I'm also going to take away, apart from focusing on where my food comes from and connecting locally through that and more broadly to our rural community, is walking as much as I can rather than jumping in the car. I'm lucky that we do live really centrally, but you never know the journeys that you have and the people you connect with and just the things that you notice when you're walking through your community. It's a much more detailed view, and even just spending more time at the local coffee shop and connecting that way, I think really enriches your experience. So really simple things, but just taking the time to do that, I think, is incredibly important. Yeah. A few suggestions coming through on the chat. Again, about exchanging food with neighbours, which is really beautiful. And again, I feel like food is that the common ground that connects us, even thinking about the Christmas parties that we might have with communities and bringing them together. And homegrown fruit and vegetables, people are sharing those over the fence, which is fantastic. So, really beautiful suggestions from everyone.
We also have which I think is absolute. Well, there's two things that are really good fun, and I think they're really great community builders. One, at the end of our street, we have a shared library. So it's like a little pillar box, and people can put books. But the best thing is there's a stick library at the dog park for the dogs. So you can get a stick out for your dog, which I think is absolutely hilarious. But yeah, all of those sort of small things, they can seem quite tiny in themselves, but I think they go towards building, much stronger communities where people do start to feel that they're connecting with one another. Yeah.
So we've heard about food and nature and walking and connection and bees and trees and the physical, the community. And I think there was one point earlier about the spiritual, not necessarily religious, but in terms of really thinking about connection to place in various ways. So lots of really interesting insights there. We have 2 minutes left. I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts on what this means for SheEO moving forward. Should SheEO, are there any ideas or actions or asks or gives for the SheEO network as a now online global community about thinking about community and systems change?
I think SheEO is doing a fantastic job as they are to drive those systems changes. I mean, listening to the girls speak this morning or earlier, I don't think there's anything more inspiring than that, seeing the younger generation really getting up there and creating the future, I think, is important. So I feel like empowering more younger activators and ventures, I think, is incredibly important. And I think you know, whilst it's not necessarily that local community, I think it is building that global community and supporting each other through that and getting people together as often as they can and having as many different, I guess, avenues for communication and connecting to be able to facilitate that, which I think they, you know, are definitely doing incredibly well.
Yeah, I think radical generosity as well is a huge part of community, because when you're giving more back to your community, you're going to get more from the community. So yeah, it feels like something that I want to practice and continue practicing.
Awesome. I think we're going to be cut off and brought back at any moment, but thank you for all the great comments and chats. This has been really fun.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.